January 1945. Somewhere near the western edge of Germany, the night does not sleep. Floodlights hang over a temporary ammunition depot carved into frozen ground. Their white glare cuts through drifting mist, revealing rows of olive-drab trucks backed tightly against stacks of wooden crates. The air smells of oil, cold metal, and damp earth. Steel clasps snap open. Ammunition boxes scrape across planks. The rhythm is steady, unbroken, relentless. Women move between the trucks in heavy coats and wool caps, their breath visible in the cold. They lift shells, count crates, mark manifests, and pass loads hand to hand. No shouting, no hesitation, just repetition, discipline, and time pressing forward. The work continues hour after hour, long after darkness has erased the horizon. A short distance away, behind wire and guarded silence, captured German soldiers watch. Many have marched for days. They have seen cities burned and divisions erased. But this is unfamiliar. In their army, women were never meant to stand here, under lights, feeding a front line that never seems to run dry. The loading does not stop when midnight passes. It is not slow when frost hardens the ground. And as the night stretches on, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. This war is being sustained by hands the German army never prepared to face. That realization did not begin here. It was shaped by years of war, doctrine, and decisions that led both sides to this frozen night. The silence that settled over those German prisoners in early 1945 had been forming long before the war reached their homeland. It began not on the Western Front, but in the years when nations decided how they would fight a modern industrial war. In Germany, the foundations were ideological. From the rise of the Third Reich in 1933, the role of women was rigidly defined. Nazi doctrine emphasized motherhood, domestic responsibility, and demographic expansion. Women were praised as bearers of the future, not participants in combat industry or military logistics. While women worked in factories out of necessity as the war dragged on, their presence remained largely hidden from the battlefield itself. The German army, shaped by Prussian tradition, was an institution of hierarchy, obedience, and male exclusivity. Authority flowed downward. Labor followed rigid lines. The front was the front. The home was the home. Across the Atlantic, the United States was building a different framework, one not born of ideology, but of scale. When America entered the war after December 7th, 1941, it did not merely mobilize an army. It mobilized a society. The challenge was not just to defeat Germany and Japan militarily, but to supply forces operating across two oceans, multiple continents, and climates ranging from desert to Arctic cold. By 1942, the United States faced a logistical reality unmatched in history. Millions of men were being trained, transported, fed, armed, and maintained. Every rifle fired on the front depended on factories, ports, railroads, depots, and distribution hubs thousands of miles behind the lines. Ammunition consumption rates climbed at a scale few planners had predicted. Artillery units in Europe could fire thousands of rounds in a single day. Tanks burned fuel faster than pipelines could replace it. Aircraft demanded constant resupply of bombs, spare parts, and aviation fuel. This pressure forced structural change. The U.S. military understood early that manpower alone would not solve the problem. Labor had to be reassigned intelligently. Roles traditionally held by men, clerical work, communications, mechanical repair, supply administration, were open to women to free male soldiers for combat duty. In May 1942, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established. 1 year later, it became the Women's Army Corps, granting women full military status. By the end of the war, more than 150,000 women would serve in the WWII, deployed not only across the United States, but throughout the European and Pacific theaters. They wore uniforms, followed military discipline, and operated under Army command structures. Their assignments were not symbolic. They were practical, necessary, and increasingly close to the front. At the same time, the U.S. Navy expanded the waves, the Coast Guard formed the spars, and the Marine Corps accepted women into support roles. Together, these forces transformed the American military into a system where logistics became as decisive as firepower. Yet none of this was immediately visible to the enemy. German intelligence reports focused on tanks, divisions, aircraft numbers, and industrial output. What they underestimated was the depth of the Allied support system and the social flexibility that sustained it. By 1943, American women were already repairing vehicles, managing supply depots, maintaining communications networks, and coordinating shipments across oceans. Their work was rarely photographed, rarely filmed, almost never discussed in enemy briefings. But it was laying the groundwork for what German soldiers would later witness firsthand. As Allied forces prepared to return to Western Europe, this hidden army of logistics became indispensable. And when the invasion finally came, it would drag these support systems forward, closer to danger, closer to the front, and eventually into view of the men fighting against them. That moment would arrive in the summer of 1944, when the Allied landings in France transformed planning into survival and logistics into the difference between advance and collapse. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the war in Western Europe entered a phase defined less by individual battles and more by movement. The beaches were only the beginning. What followed was a race inland, through hedgerows, across rivers, and into a continent whose infrastructure had been shattered by years of occupation and bombing. Victory no longer depended solely on taking ground. It depended on feeding momentum. The German army, experienced in rapid maneuver warfare, understood this truth well. Blitzkrieg had always relied on speed, fuel, and uninterrupted supply. But by 1944, Germany's logistical system was stretched thin. Rail networks were damaged. Fuel shortages were chronic. Replacement equipment arrived late, or not at all. Every retreat magnified these weaknesses. The Allies faced a different problem. They possessed enormous industrial capacity, but distance threatened to choke it. Supplies landed on open beaches. Ports were damaged or unusable. Roads were narrow, crowded, and often under fire. Yet American and British forces were advancing faster than planners had expected. Success itself became a logistical danger. A single U.S. infantry division required hundreds of tons of supplies per day. Armored divisions consumed even more. Artillery ammunition was expended at unprecedented rates. During heavy fighting, a single battery could fire thousands of rounds in 24 hours. Without constant replenishment, guns fell silent. Advances stalled. Units became vulnerable. To solve this, the Allies created one of the most ambitious supply systems in military history. The Red Ball Express was established in August 1944, a nonstop trucking network running day and night from Normandy depots to forward units. Thousands of trucks moved in convoys, bypassing railroads and damaged ports. Speed mattered more than comfort. Drivers slept beside roads. Repairs were done in place. Breakdowns were pushed aside. Behind these convoys stood vast depots, temporary cities of crates, fuel drums, spare parts, and ammunition. These depots operated on a 24-hour cycle. There were no off hours. Night was not a pause. It was a necessity. Darkness offered concealment from air attack and allowed movement without congestion. It was here that American women became increasingly visible to the war effort. Women assigned to ordnance, quartermaster, and administrative units worked alongside men in these rear, but not safe areas. They handled inventory, paperwork, vehicle maintenance records, and increasingly physical labor. Ammunition had to be sorted, counted, and loaded with precision. A single error could delay an entire battalion's resupply. Fatigue was a constant risk. Discipline was the safeguard. As the front moved east through France and into Belgium, supply depots followed. They crept closer to artillery range. Air raids became more frequent. In December 1944, the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, forced emergency adjustments. Supply lines were cut. Units were surrounded. Ammunition shortages threatened disaster. In response, the Allied logistical system surged. Depots relocated overnight. Truck routes were rerouted through snow and forest. Loading schedules intensified. Women in support units found themselves working longer hours under harsher conditions, often within range of enemy artillery or air attack. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed toward the German heartland, supply points were established on German soil itself. For the first time, German soldiers, many captured during the rapid collapse of their defensive lines, were held near areas where American logistics operated openly and relentlessly. They saw trucks arriving in endless lines. They saw crates stacked higher than buildings. And at night, under floodlights, they saw women loading weapons, checking manifests, and sustaining an army that never seemed to slow. To them, this was not merely a logistical difference. It was a cultural shock. The German military system had not prepared its soldiers for an enemy that mobilized every capable hand, regardless of gender, and placed them where the war demanded. That shock deepened when these scenes were examined from multiple angles: human, tactical, and moral, each revealing a different reason why the war was turning decisively against the Axis. The scene German soldiers witnessed near those ammunition depots can be understood only by examining it from multiple perspectives. What appeared, at first glance, as a simple logistical operation carried deeper meanings about endurance, doctrine, and the nature of total war. Human angle. For the American women working those nights, the task was not symbolic. It was physical, repetitive, and exhausting. Ammunition crates weighed anywhere from 20 to over 100 pounds, depending on caliber. Shells had to be handled carefully, stacked correctly, and documented precisely. Cold-numbed fingers. Sleep came in fragments. Shifts often ran 10 to 12 hours, sometimes longer during emergencies. These women were trained to function under pressure, but training did not eliminate fatigue. What sustained them was routine and responsibility. Each crate loaded meant guns firing the next day. Each truck dispatched meant soldiers on the line were not left waiting. Many had brothers, husbands, or friends fighting somewhere ahead. The work was personal, even when conducted in silence. Enemy angle. From a German perspective, this labor challenged deeply ingrained assumptions. German soldiers were accustomed to seeing women as victims of war, evacuating cities, sheltering during bombings, or working in factories far from the front. To see women operating within the military supply system, so close to combat zones, unsettled expectations. Captured soldiers later described Allied logistics as overwhelming. Trucks arrived without pause. Supplies appeared abundant even after heavy fighting. The presence of women within this system reinforced a troubling realization. The American war effort was not strained. It was structured for endurance. Cultural angle. This contrast reflected two different approaches to total war. Germany mobilized under constraint, ideology, and scarcity. The United States mobilized under pragmatism. Gender roles, while still limited, were flexible enough to meet operational needs. Authority existed, but initiative was encouraged. In these depots, gender mattered less than efficiency. Work was assigned. It was completed, and it continued through the night. This cultural divergence was not merely symbolic. It translated into operational advantage, and it was reinforced by leadership choices and technological systems that amplified every hour of labor. Those deeper mechanisms would become clearer when examined through the lenses of command structure and material superiority. Beyond the human and cultural dimensions, the presence of American women in forward logistics revealed deeper structural strengths within the Allied war effort, strengths that extended from leadership philosophy to technological organization. Leadership angle. The integration of women into critical support roles was not accidental. It reflected deliberate command decisions shaped by necessity and foresight. Senior U.S. Army planners understood that modern war was no longer won solely by frontline bravery. It was sustained by systems. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, emphasized coordination, adaptability, and logistics as the foundation of operational success. Commanders delegated authority within structured limits. Officers trusted subordinates to manage supply flows, maintain discipline, and adjust schedules as conditions changed. Women serving in ordnance and quartermaster units operated within this framework. They followed orders, but they were also expected to think, report problems, and maintain standards without constant supervision. This flexibility contrasted sharply with German command culture, where rigid hierarchy often slowed adaptation. In American depots, efficiency mattered more than tradition. If women could perform the task reliably, they were assigned the task. Technological angle. American industrial capacity translated into logistical precision. Standardized packaging, mechanized loading equipment, and detailed inventory systems reduced chaos. Ammunition was categorized, labeled, and tracked through multiple stages of movement. Errors were documented and corrected quickly. Women working these systems were trained not only in manual labor, but in record-keeping and coordination. Paperwork mattered as much as muscle. A missing crate could halt an advance. A miscount could delay artillery support. Accuracy became a form of combat power. Moral angle. There was also a moral dimension. The visible involvement of women in sustaining the war effort reinforced a sense of shared national purpose. This was not an army fighting alone. It was a society engaged in survival and victory. For German soldiers observing from captivity, this realization cut deeply. It suggested that defeat was not merely a matter of lost battles, but of being outmatched in collective resolve. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, these advantages converged. Logistics accelerated, resistance weakened, and the war approached its decisive phase, not with a single battle, but with an irreversible shift in momentum. That shift would soon manifest in the final advances of early 1945, where supply, speed, and endurance combined to break what remained of German resistance. By January 1945, the Western Front had become a race against time, weather, and attrition. German forces, weakened by months of retreat and shortages, were holding what remained of the Siegfried Line. American and Allied troops pressed forward, but every mile advance depended on supplies, ammunition, fuel, rations, and repair parts. Without them, armored columns stalled. Artillery grew silent. The front risked collapse under its own logistical weight. At forward depots in the Rhineland, the intensity of operations escalated. Trucks queued under floodlights, engines rumbling, as the night air grew colder and frost hardened the ground. Ammunition crates were stacked in precise formations, their metallic weight echoing across the compound. Here, women of the Women's Army Corps, alongside male colleagues, labored relentlessly, lifting, counting, and loading shells into trucks bound for artillery units only miles from German lines. Their shifts extended from dusk until the gray pre-dawn light, often without breaks beyond short water pauses. Sleep was minimal, but the flow of material never faltered. German prisoners, held nearby, could not ignore the spectacle. Officers recorded in post-war interrogations that they watched silently, fatigued from forced marches, cold, and hunger. They had expected to see men handling these tasks, perhaps under duress, perhaps clumsily. Instead, women moved efficiently, without hesitation or complaint, sustaining a front line they would never confront directly. The discipline and stamina were undeniable. The prisoners' reports noted the sound of endless stamping boots, the rustle of crates, and the occasional hiss of hydraulic lifts, but no shouting, no disorder, just the relentless rhythm of labor. At the same time, the scale of the operation became clear. Forward artillery units received continuous resupply, enabling them to fire without interruption against retreating or entrenched German positions. Tank battalions, moving along icy roads, were refueled and rearmed each night. Every hour of loading extended the reach of Allied forces and compounded the strain on German defenses. The front, which the Germans assumed would slow in winter conditions, instead maintained pressure. The German soldiers' silence was not merely a response to surprise. It was a recognition. The war was no longer being decided by heroic charges or single engagements alone. It was being determined by sustained endurance, coordination, and adaptability, qualities exemplified in this night labor. Every shell loaded, every truck dispatched, extended the gap between expectation and reality for the Axis forces. As dawn approached over the Rhine, the results of these efforts were poised to manifest. Artillery could bombard positions earlier than expected. Infantry and armor could advance without pause. German resistance, already weakened, faced a systematic, inexorable pressure. The culmination of months of planning, industrial effort, and the integration of women into critical roles had brought the Allies to a decisive operational advantage. This relentless efficiency would soon produce unmistakable outcomes in the battles to follow, confirming that the true turning point of the campaign was not a single clash of arms, but the sustained logistical supremacy that allowed the Allies to advance while German forces struggled merely to survive. As January 1945 progressed, the Allied advance accelerated toward the heart of Germany. Forward units were no longer just pushing back German lines. They were exploiting gaps, seizing bridges, and forcing retreats that German commanders could barely react to. Every mile gained depended on supply. The men at the front relied not on heroics alone, but on the rhythm established hours earlier by the women working through the night. In depots along the Rhine, the night operations intensified. Trucks laden with shells, small arms, and spare parts moved like clockwork. WWII personnel ensured that artillery batteries could fire first thing in the morning. Communications units transmitted updates to coordinate with advancing divisions. Supply officers tracked every crate, every pallet, every barrel of fuel. Mistakes could halt in advance, but mistakes were rare. Efficiency had become a weapon in itself. German prisoners, forced to observe from nearby compounds, were acutely aware of this efficiency. Post-war memoirs record that soldiers described a sense of helplessness. They could see the work continuing uninterrupted, even as their own units struggled with fuel shortages, winter storms, and fragmented command. The contrast between expectation and reality was stark. Where German doctrine assumed war labor near the front would be male-dominated, improvised, and faltering under pressure, they witnessed order, discipline, and stamina, delivered primarily by women in uniform. The cumulative effect on German defensive planning was significant. Units were forced to retreat under fire with inadequate support. Counterattacks faltered. Artillery positions were neutralized because the Allies could sustain their own batteries relentlessly. Forward commanders reported surprise at how quickly enemy positions were abandoned, attributing part of the collapse to the unbroken supply chain that reached the front faster than they could intercept. By late January, the logistical superiority established in those night operations had become a strategic advantage. Frontline commanders praised the night loaders as unsung contributors to victory. Each crate moved by WWII personnel meant a battalion could fight another day. Each truck dispatched allowed armored divisions to maintain momentum despite harsh winter conditions. The war was being sustained, and ultimately won, by those operating far from the front lines, yet whose impact was immediate and visible. For the German soldiers watching silently, it was more than a logistical lesson. It was an indictment of their assumptions, a cultural shock, and a quiet humiliation. Their manuals, doctrine, and expectations could not account for the resilience of a force sustained by an entire society mobilized, where gender did not limit capability and discipline did not falter under exhaustion. These soldiers would carry that memory for the remainder of the campaign. The sight of women loading weapons all night, the mechanical precision and the human endurance that the Axis forces could not replicate. And as the Allies pressed further into the Rhineland and beyond, these night operations foreshadowed the inevitable collapse of German defenses. The front lines were not merely shifting. They were breaking under the combined weight of firepower, supply, and unyielding human labor. He's seen at the depots had become a microcosm of the broader war. relentless, organized, and historically decisive. The relentless night operations conducted by American women in the final months of the Western Front left tangible, verifiable effects on the battlefield. By February 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine in multiple sectors, consolidating their position within Germany. Ammunition shortages, which had threatened to stall advances during the winter, had been entirely mitigated by the continuous supply chain maintained at forward depots. Every artillery battery, tank column, and infantry regiment had access to what they required, allowing operations to proceed without interruption. Reports from field commanders document the direct consequences. General Courtney Hodges, commanding the First Army, highlighted the critical importance of continuous resupply during the push across the Rhineland. He noted that even in the harsh winter conditions, combat effectiveness was preserved because depots remained stocked and operational 24/7. Units were able to advance, reorganize, and strike repeatedly without pausing to wait for essential material. German resistance was increasingly fragmented. Supply shortages had been a constant challenge for the Wehrmacht since the Normandy landings, but now the effects were magnified by the Americans' operational stamina. Forward German units experienced intermittent artillery barrages that could be sustained indefinitely. Tank crews found themselves counterattacked repeatedly by armored divisions operating at full capacity. Defensive positions were abandoned more quickly, not necessarily because of the overwhelming firepower alone, but because German commanders recognized they could not match the continuous supply-driven tempo of the American advance. Casualty reports corroborate these operational advantages. Units relying on forward resupply suffered fewer instances of mission failure due to logistical delays. POW reports later emphasized the psychological effect as well. German soldiers were aware that the Americans could maintain operational readiness in conditions where German forces were struggling simply to survive. The silent endurance of women loading weapons all night became emblematic of a broader systemic superiority that the Axis forces could not counter. Meanwhile, recognition of the women's contribution grew within the U.S. Army. Military communiques and internal evaluations praised the work of WWII personnel in ordnance and supply. Their labor was directly linked to the uninterrupted flow of combat operations and, by extension, to the successes achieved in the Rhineland and subsequent operations into central Germany. These acknowledgments were documented in unit histories, such as those maintained by the Quartermaster Corps, which emphasized efficiency, accuracy, and reliability of night operations as decisive factors in sustaining the front. The broader implications were both tactical and operational. The ability to maintain continuous supply allowed commanders to plan with confidence, knowing that logistics would not limit their options. It reinforced the principle that modern warfare was as much about sustaining forces as it was about defeating enemy formations. The quiet, uncelebrated labor of women in uniform demonstrated that battlefield outcomes depended not solely on courage under fire, but on the disciplined execution of support functions that ensured combat power could be projected continuously. The German soldiers who observed these operations, initially incredulous, were left to process the implications. Their silence was not only a response to surprise, but a recognition of an unassailable advantage. In their accounts, the efficiency and resilience of American logistics, particularly when embodied by women performing physically demanding and high-responsibility tasks, became a symbol of the larger systemic superiority of the Allied forces. This realization would haunt German commanders and soldiers alike, shaping both immediate battlefield morale and post-war reflections on the collapse of the Western Front. As February turned to March 1945, the consequences of the continuous night operations became increasingly evident across the Western Front. Allied forces, buoyed by reliable resupply, executed rapid advances into the heart of Germany. The Ruhr industrial region, long considered a defensive stronghold, fell under sustained pressure. Artillery and armor maintained operational readiness far beyond what German forces had anticipated. Where the Wehrmacht had once relied on mobility and surprise, they now faced a relentless, well-supported opponent whose endurance was amplified by every crate loaded, every shell dispatched, and every truck that departed the depots without pause. Field reports from this period describe the psychological effect on German units. Soldiers, weakened by months of retreat and scarcity, were demoralized not only by advancing troops, but by the apparent endlessness of Allied supply chains. Prisoners recounted observing the night work of American women, noting their discipline and stamina. These observations highlighted a cultural and operational disparity that extended beyond the battlefield. In many cases, German soldiers expressed a mixture of disbelief and resignation, recognizing that no matter how valiant their resistance, they were constrained by shortages that the Allies systematically eliminated. The U.S. military recognized the importance of documenting these achievements. WWII units received commendations for their indispensable role in sustaining combat operations. Quartermaster Corps records from early 1945 emphasized that efficiency and accuracy in ammunition handling directly correlated with the success of frontline offensives. The combined effect of night operations, mechanized transport, and meticulous record-keeping allowed Allied forces to maintain an operational tempo that German units could not match. Logistically, the success of these operations provided more than immediate battlefield advantage. It established a model for the integration of women into military support roles, demonstrating both capability and reliability under extreme conditions. Post-war evaluations noted that their contribution was pivotal in ensuring that armored, infantry, and artillery units could maintain uninterrupted pressure, ultimately hastening the collapse of German defensive lines. By the time Allied units crossed the Rhine and pressed toward the industrial heartland of Germany, the effectiveness of the night loading operations had been fully realized. German forces, already depleted and overstretched, faced not only the threat of combat, but the systematic reality that their opponents could sustain operations indefinitely. This logistical dominance, quiet, disciplined, and unheralded, was a decisive factor in the rapid conclusion of the Western campaign. Ultimately, the work of these women left an enduring imprint on military operations and historical memory. They demonstrated that total war demanded total participation, and that victory was as dependent on the continuous, unglamorous labor behind the front lines as it was on strategy, tactics, or firepower. The silent observation of German soldiers, their astonishment, and the strategic implications of these operations would become a defining narrative of the final months of the European theater. The image of American women loading weapons all night, observed in silence by German soldiers, endures as a testament to the hidden machinery of modern war. Victory is often measured in battles won or cities captured, but the true enablers, the people who keep armies supplied, fueled, and operational, rarely appear in history books. In this case, their labor reshaped not only the battlefield, but the perception of who could contribute meaningfully to total war. These night operations demonstrated the integration of society into warfare. The ability of the United States to mobilize women for essential roles reflected both necessity and ingenuity. They were not just supporting soldiers, they were sustaining combat power itself. Their endurance, discipline, and precision allowed entire offensives to proceed without interruption, directly influencing outcomes that German forces could neither anticipate nor counter. From a broader perspective, this episode illustrates the interplay between culture, logistics, and operational success. German expectations of gender roles, rigid and doctrinal, collided with a system that valued efficiency and adaptability over tradition. In the silent observation of the enemy, the war revealed itself not merely as a contest of arms, but as a measure of organizational capacity, human endurance, and societal cohesion. Historically, these contributions laid groundwork for post-war changes in military policy and social perception. Women's capabilities in high responsibility, physically demanding roles became undeniable. Their service challenged assumptions, redefined roles, and added a new dimension to the understanding of what it takes to win a modern war. Ultimately, the night operations near the Rhine stand as a reminder. Wars are won not only by courage under fire, but by the sustained, often unseen labor of those who keep the engines of battle moving. In the quiet determination of American women lifting shells under floodlights, one sees the convergence of human effort, strategic foresight, and operational necessity, a convergence that helped decide the fate of nations while shaping the future of warfare itself.